Welcome, everyone. This is a presentation on Pragmatic Lean Portfolio Management. I'm your speaker today, as was just called out. In case some of you don't know me, my name is Charlene Cuenca. I'm a principal consultant, SPCT, and a SAFE contributor, and I work for Icon Agility Services. So, what I wanted to cover with you guys today was really related to, we've talked about some of the business agility journey that SAFE 5.0 is taking us on, and lean portfolio management remains one of the top core competencies in the framework. So what I wanted to discuss today was just giving a quick overview of some of the lean portfolio management competency, especially as it relates to business agility and some of the new things that we're promoting in 5.0. But what I wanted to really spend a lot of time on is really the practical application of some of the theoretical stuff we talk about all the time in lean portfolio management. So I wanted to take some of the practices that I've used in the field and kind of talk through, if you guys are interested in setting up your own lean portfolio management capability to help your organization, where do you get started? What are some of the things you should think through? What are some of the considerations? And you'll notice that I'm going to go through three pretty common threads. They're going to be interwoven throughout the presentation, and that's going to include, a flow-based system in our Portfolio Kanban, making sure we understand, whatever processes we put in place. How do we handle, mixed mode portfolios? Because generally, you're going to start out with not everyone is on the agile journey at the same time. So how do we handle that and still stand up the portfolio capability? The other piece, too, that I think is a very important thread is really related to making sure we have cross-functional engagement. If you put a flow-based system in place, but you're still following more phases and roles and handoffs, that's not really helping your process. So I want to use that as a common theme as well. So, the context of lean portfolio management. Like I said, Dean did a wonderful job this morning on the keynote talking about the 7 core competencies of 5.0 and how they support business agility, which is a common theme at the SAFE Summit this year. So lean portfolio management, as I mentioned before, is one of the 7 core competencies, and it remains a focal point. But one of the things that, it was called out earlier and is one of the themes in lean portfolio management is that we want to make sure we're promoting this as that planning horizon that we have in the framework that ties strategy to execution. That's a very, very important concept to understand, because even if you use something like Essential Safe and you're maybe just standing up your agile release train, we always need to understand where strategy comes from and how what we're doing in our planning sessions and how our teams are aligning to value delivery actually tie back to the strategy. And I think that's actually a gap in a lot of organizations. So I wanted to talk through how we can bridge that gap. And, like I said, what I wanted to call out here is that in 5.0, that's a very big focal point that we want to make sure that we view lean portfolio management as that kind of tie back between strategy and execution. So as you can see here, there's 7 core competencies, and they enable the SAFE 4 core values. So you're going to hear me talk quite a bit as well about alignment and transparency, because that's a really important thread as well. The reason we have lean portfolio management is so that we can have transparency and alignment on the upstream process that feed our trains. Right? So you notice the graphic didn't change a whole lot in 5.0, with the exception of we've added some additional explicit definitions on the roles so that you can see in the different areas under the lean portfolio management competency, you've got the roles tied directly to those areas that they are supporting. So you'll see the cross-functional nature of this when you look across, strategy and investment funding, lean governance, and then also agile portfolio operations. So just looking at strategy and investment funding, which ties back to what I was just saying with aligning strategy to execution, that we've got our executives, so we need to understand what our stakeholders need. We've got the technical components for our runway, so that's our architecture representation. And we always need to make sure we're maintaining alignment with the business. So that's why you see the business owners here. You'll notice, as you look at the different roles in lean portfolio management, and as we go through what lean portfolio management supporting, there's always this pattern that you'll see of multiple roles and functions being supported. And like I said, that's a very, very common thread that's going to be interwoven throughout this presentation. So when we look at the support of the lean portfolio management competency in SAFE 5.0, it helps us because if we're looking at the upstream demand management and how we want to feed the highest priorities to our trains, if we set the upstream strategy alignment process and that flow-based Kanban system to support this, then we can start to trust the downstream portion of this, and we can decentralize decision-making to where it makes the most sense. So that really ties to SAFE principle number 9, right, with decentralized decision-making. The other piece is making sure that, standing up a lean portfolio capability is important because it helps us apply systems thinking. If we're only thinking about what do we have to deliver, when do we have to deliver, and how is that going to be sequenced, we're really missing a big component because we're not tying it back to the actual strategy and the business that we should be supporting. And that's very, very key for anyone to understand in the system, regardless of where you're at, whether you be at an agile team or a team on the train, the program team, or even portfolio team. We need to understand how what we're doing actively ties back to the strategy of the organization and the different portfolios within them. So that really ties to SAFE principle number 2. So what about lean portfolio management? Do I need that in all cases? When should I think about using this? Well, the nice thing about SAFE 5.0, it really, the new version of the implementation roadmap really starts to plant the seed that we might need some lean portfolio management practices early on in our journey, maybe even earlier than we originally considered before. In previous versions of the framework, we didn't have lean portfolio management even as something that we should be thinking about until very late in the implementation roadmap. But through my experience and working with different companies, I know that that was always a gap, because I know that you come into a company, you're trying to help them, you understand that they may have some challenges, and a lot of times it's with that upstream process. We've got different strategic things, Charlene, that we work on, but the teams don't have visibility on what that is. They don't have visibility on the backlog, what the true priorities are, the different strategic initiatives, and that creates a gap, because then we have our trains and our teams just simply building backlog items but not knowing the why. And the why to me is very, very important, especially when we think about true business agility. We need to understand the outcomes that we're trying to achieve for our business, and we need to make sure we understand, how the things that we're working on, whether it be an epic or a feature or a story, actually ties back to that outcome we're trying to achieve. And without that common thread running through the epic features and stories, we're really just simply doing work. And as we know, if we only do work, that's not always going to lead to the outcomes that support the business. And that might lead to, the downstream impacts of, I built something, but I don't think it's necessarily all going to be used, right? And that's definitely what we want to avoid. So, with a client I'd worked with previously, we did we had a really good implementation of SAFE. It was a really good transformation, and it started to become embedded in the culture. But one of the things we did kind of retroactively was look back on the previous 12 to 14 months, and I asked the question, how do you think things went? What do you think we did well? And what is something you would change if you could? And one of the things that the leader that I was working with said was, Charlene, we did some really great things, but if I would have had my way and could wave a magic wand, I would have started lean portfolio management much sooner. So I know that, in that case, that actually would have helped some of the challenges that we had if we did start it sooner. And because of that, I've introduced these concepts with other clients so that we start thinking about them much earlier in the journey, and it lines up very closely to the SAFE implementation roadmap. So basically the takeaway is consider lean portfolio management concepts early, plant the seeds. Even though you might not be using all of them out of the gate, at least start to look at, a flow-based process, limiting WIP, making everything visible so that you can have the right information to make the decision, the trade-off decisions you need to make with leadership. All right? So then that brings in, if we understand the value of lean portfolio management, we understand that getting those concepts or the seeds for those concepts planted early can actually help our system, then how do we actually get started? Because there's a lot there. What do we need to get started with first? And what I wanted to make sure we understood too is lean portfolio management is not something you turn on or off like a light switch, right? It's a journey. It's something that we have to make sure that, we're going to walk into a transition phase where we're looking at mixed mode in our portfolio, because we may have some agile teams working. We may even have some agile trains, but chances are all of your delivery groups are not necessarily using agile practices out of the gate. So that means that there's an implementation roadmap in play. There's going to be different groups that are working in agile versus in waterfall. So we want to make sure that we actually start to, build the lean portfolio management concepts in as we're transitioning these groups into the lean agile way of working that SAFE promotes, right? So not only do you have mixed mode of agile and waterfall, you also have, for the trains that you've stood up and started and launched, there may be actually varying levels of maturity. So with that, that's also another area you want to look at as well. So you may have your trains there, but they're not necessarily going at the same pace, and they might not be as mature. And then when it comes to the actual portfolio process as a whole, the adoption of the lean agile mindset within your portfolio, that also takes time. And not every leader that's part of your portfolio team is necessarily going to adopt that mindset out of the gate. So all those three factors come into play, really translate into setting the right expectation that lean portfolio management is a journey. And it's important to get started with the concepts, but you're going to have to coach through this and basically, continue to learn as you go in your specific portfolio context. Okay, so now let's get into real practical application. So let's look at some techniques and some thought patterns that we can go through as we start thinking about standing up our portfolio capability and some of the different flow-based processes within them. So in this big picture diagram, what you notice here is kind of an at-a-glance view of the system. And, like I was saying earlier, a lot of times we may have some agile teams, we may have some waterfall teams, we may even have some agile release trains or agile team of teams. But one of the things that seems to be a common pattern is really having clarity on the upstream flow. Like, I know I work on features. I know that's what we plan in PIs. I know that we have objectives. I know that teams break features down into stories. But what about that strategic layer above the train? How does that happen? And then how do I get visibility on that so I know that when I'm refining features with my train and with my product owners, that those are actually tying back to the intent we're trying to get to. So this is what makes the lean portfolio management competency an important one, because we need to make sure that that upstream process is explicitly defined and that we start thinking about what's best for our specific context so that we can provide that transparency and alignment as our trains are going through these cycles of planning. So in order to be successful, and like I said, this was the third thread that I said was going to be running through the presentation, we need to always make sure that we have cross-functional engagement. So that means as we move through, the portfolio Kanban, and this is the typical out-of-the-box, recommended states for the portfolio Kanban, where we have a funnel, we've got some analysis that we do, we review the epic, the portfolio backlog are where prioritized epics will sit, and then we'll go into implementing as these features that are associated with epics start getting executed, and then at some point, the portfolio leadership team will decide if that epic has achieved most of its value, and we may call it done. But when we talk about that is not necessarily done in silos, and it's not necessarily always a linear process. We need to make sure that we look at cross-functional engagement to make sure that we are aligned as we move from left to right. That's a very, very key item here, because if we don't do that, we're going from left to right with some assumptions that may not be valid. And if you go through with those assumptions and you don't have those conversations to co-create the epic as you go, there's a pretty high chance that you'll go all the way into the portfolio backlog, or worse, into implementing, where you're going to discover something that may actually move you back in this cycle. So you want to mitigate that as much as possible by making sure that the roles that are part of your portfolio are engaged in and with as you move through the Kanban system. So you see some of the roles called out here, right? Your typical portfolio roles, like your epic owner, is the one that's usually shepherding your epics through your portfolio Kanban system. But along that kind of trio of roles that we're always talking about, we always want to make sure the business is engaged with. So our business owners, knowing who our business owners are and making sure that they're aligned with what we think from a scope perspective, an outcome perspective, and the priorities of the epics we're considering in our value delivery area, as well as architecture, because we've got architectural needs that we're going to need to weave into our portfolio backlog in the form of enablers. And if we don't have those discussions with our architects early and often, we may find out that some of the things we're trying to do for the business and for our customers are not technically viable. Or we didn't think about the technical ramifications on how long something might take and what needs to be enabled first. So engaging with our business, engaging with architecture, as well as engineering and product management of your trains that are most likely going to have to do work as part of the delivery, on an ongoing basis is very, very important here, right? Because that maintains the alignment. And while it sounds like, I get questions a lot where, well, gee, Charlene, that's a lot of roles to put in a room. Can't we just write the epic and just validate it with IT that we had the right size? What do you guys think about that? No, because what we're trying to do is validate our assumptions, and more often than not, just having a simple conversation, your validation of what you thought the intent was and the size and all those things that go into the epic is going to be invalidated pretty quickly, and that actually will save you time. It'll save you cycles. So this is why I focus very heavily on cross-functional engagement. So let's take a closer look at that portfolio Kanban, because this is really one of the crucial areas when we're trying to at least stand up the capability, is really making it explicit. So you want to make sure you're asking the right questions and with your cross-functional portfolio team so that you can come up with the right exit criteria. And your exit criteria is not always going to be this cut and paste template that every company will use. It really is part of your local context. So there are some things that are going to be pretty common, I think, between different organizations. But for the most part, you need to look at the industry that you're in and then what type of work you do. Are you heavily regulated and whatnot? So let me take you through some of these states and some of the recommended questions you should be asking yourself as you stand up a lean portfolio management capability. Obviously, when we look at the first state on the left-hand side here, the funnel, there's no WIP limit here, so anything can go in here. So the main point that I want to make is, because we can put anything in the funnel, do you think we want to over-design what goes in the funnel? Do we need to have a lot of criteria for what we put in the funnel? No, because anything can go in here. We could have a list of 100 things, ideas, opportunities to consider, and if we try to put too much detail in there, we're incurring a form of waste. So at the very least, you just need to have a short title and just an understanding of who the requester was. That should be enough to start a conversation, right? That's the point I'm trying to make. These are conversation starters. And then as we move into review, this is really where we're going to have WIP limits associated with the things that we could work on, these opportunities. But it's really a chance to have a conversation with that cross-functional group to make sure that we're truly staying aligned on what items, what the item is actually trying to deliver. What outcome are we trying to achieve? And then who actually is going to be impacted by this is usually a common question. Because depending on the type of epic it is and what part of the value stream this may be associated with in your portfolio, there may be some additional constraints on here, and you need to make sure those folks that are involved in those areas are engaged with. At the bare minimum, you're going to have your portfolio leadership team, and then the conversation being driven by your epic owner. But there may be a need for you to engage more heavily with your architecture group because of the type of work you're doing. Or maybe you need to bring legal in there, or compliance, or vendor management, or some of these other groups we don't always think about, or we think about them further downstream. If you can engage with them or at least ask the question, are we going to need them as part of this epic? Are we going to need them as part of this discussion? Then you know that you're going to have to engage with them as you move from left to right. But the main goal when the epic is in review is simply to define what are we trying to do and what benefit are we trying to achieve. Moving into analysis, some of the questions you need to be considering are related to, we want to make sure that these are WIP limited as well, because we're not simply trying to create a model where we push everything through because we think it's high priority. We want to make sure that we're doing our due diligence and using our cross-functional team in these epic refinements to actually co-create the epic so that we don't go through here with these kind of hidden assumptions being invalidated. We want to make sure that we're talking through them and we have agreement. So we do want to limit WIP because we know that we're working in a fixed capacity type of model, right? I have not been to an organization yet that has unlimited capacity with people sitting on the bench just waiting. I'd love to have work to do. I'm so bored today. I've not seen that yet. Usually we have fixed capacity and a limited budget, right? So in that kind of model, we can't work on everything. So unless we set WIP limits here, we're setting the wrong expectation with our stakeholders. They're thinking if things are moving through the Kanban, that means we're going to start them soon. And unless we put WIP limits there, that expectation is going to make our stakeholders very frustrated when they are wondering why things take so long. And that's what's happening today. So set the WIP limits, set them low, experiment with what the right WIP limit is for you, and then like I said, co-create the epics as you move from left to right. Now, I said in review, the point we're trying to make here is we're just trying to define what are we trying to do and what's the outcome. In analysis, if now this is still high enough priority to go into analysis, now we know that we're going to need a little bit more information. So our goal here is to get enough information to get an approval, right? So we're talking about the things that go in a lean business case. We're talking about what experiments we might need to run to validate that we can actually get some value out of this in the form of an MVP. And then also, looking at making sure that we're continuing the prioritization process and also estimation process. And based on the documentation of that additional level of detail, we want to find out, is it actually viable enough for us to move through the Kanban and get approval? So that's the analysis state. Making sure that as we move from left to right, that only the highest priority items move through. The backlog probably should be WIP limited as well, right? We look, if you continually just have an unlimited WIP limit in the portfolio backlog, then even though you have WIP limits in the review and analysis state, you're continuously just moving things through, getting them in a ready and understood state, and they're sitting on the backlog now, and now your stakeholders are still under the assumption, oh, it's on the backlog, it's going to be started soon, and that's not always going to be the case. So we want to make sure that, I put here recommended that we put WIP limits here, and then making sure that if it does make it that far with the WIP limits in place, that we've now made sure that we've socialized these with the impacted trains, and maybe identified the specific teams on the trains that might have to do some work here. This is also the last responsible moment to introduce architecture, like your solution intent, and also your architecture vision and architectural runway. We should have had some of those conversations earlier on, but this would be, you want to make sure that these are actually socialized here before we actually start breaking this down into features for our program Kanbans. So that's the portfolio backlog, and that would start the chain of events to now flow down to the program, where we have the program teams of our various trains that are going to be doing work here, breaking these down so that they can now start to get those features ready for PI. And once those features are prioritized high enough that they actually go through a PI planning session, then and only then is the epic in implementing, right? Because then the teams have validated that they can actually start the work on this particular epic. So then it's in implementing. And all we're doing there in implementing now is that decentralizes to the train's execution. And our portfolio leadership team and our business owners are now just validating results as those trains are doing system demos and showing the progress that they're making. So the questions you want to ask there and make sure that you include as exit criteria are really around the outcomes you're achieving. Did the MVP show that we're actually getting value? Does it seem like we need to continue working on this epic? Maybe we need to consider pivoting because we've achieved 80% of the value, but we need to be able to ask those questions and not just simply work on an epic because we think it's not completed yet, so we have to finish it to 100%. And last but not least is the done state. So here, you're basically, when we ask the question of, how do we know when an epic's done? How do we know when it's finished? Well, it's really up to your portfolio leadership team to decide that. They decide if they get the value, and they decide when we can move this into the done state. So it's not always a black and white answer, but it's up to you guys to decide that as a portfolio leadership team, and then define the criteria for that so that you can move it to done. So establishing clear exit criteria is one of those things that you want to make sure that you do as you start forming your capability in lean portfolio management. So this next slide, once again, taking a big picture view, starts to summarize some of the themes that I've been talking about. So when we look at this, we want to make sure that we understand, some of the things that I mentioned before. In your portfolio process, you may have a mix of agile and waterfall teams. That's totally fine. That's a transition over time. So we want to account for that. So at the bottom of this graphic, you can see in the gray box, we've got agile teams and we've got waterfall teams that are working towards planned milestones. Totally fine. It's pretty common practice, actually. And they've got cadence ceremonies that they're going to run to make sure that they stay aligned. The program also has a similar type of format. And then we'll talk about the portfolio as well. But this kind of encompasses our view across the enterprise. And when you look at the other theme that I was talking about on the left-hand side, these leadership triangles, for us to maintain alignment, we want to make sure that we're engaging across functions always, that we're not going through our process with handoffs between different functions, because that's only going to cause waste, and I've seen it time and time again. So when you look at the bottom left-hand corner here, we're talking about these leadership triangles engaging, the PMO or delivery, IT and architecture, and then also, looking at product and the business. We want to make sure that there's always that type of representation. And pretty much for an agile team, that's already there, right? We've got product owners, we've got a scrum master, we've got a development team. For an agile release train, that's pretty similar pattern that's followed there as well, because we have an RTE, we've got product management, and we've got architecture and engineering represented as the third part of that leadership triangle. But what about the portfolio? It's also important to replicate that type of cross-functional engagement when you build your portfolio leadership team, because they're the ones that are going to make the decisions, and you do not, I've said this 50 million times already, you do not want to have people making decisions in a functional silo, okay? So when we look at that, you want to make sure that you've got your business owner, a business owner representative, that you got, your IT architecture kind of piece to this, and as well as somebody that's managing delivery. So we start looking at how do we stay aligned then? Like I said, for an agile team, it's pretty straightforward, right? We work in iteration cadences. We've also got the different pieces here for identifying in an iteration that we plan. Obviously, we do an iteration review, iteration retrospective. Then we have stand-ups as we're executing. The train itself also has a cadence pattern of making sure that they can stay aligned across those functions. So you've got, at the beginning of a PI cycle, you're going to do PI planning. At the end of a PI cycle, you're going to do an inspect and adapt workshop. And then in between there, you stay in sync by doing your scrum of scrums, product owner syncs, and then also refining your backlog. And the way you show value deliveries is through system demos. So that's pretty common cadence. What I've introduced in my past with some of the different organizations I've worked with is also a very heavy focus on business owners. I spend a lot of time coaching the business. I think it's very, very important that you integrate their processes into our agile way of working, our lean agile way of working, and that you give them direct coaching so that they know what it is that they need to do to support the system. Because until you do that, they're going to feel like an outsider, and they're one of the most crucial reasons we exist. So if we don't engage with them early and we don't show them how they can actually take part in this, we're really missing an opportunity. They actually, anytime I've coached business owners and then they understand the big picture view, they're very thankful, and they actually become one of the biggest advocates for our agile way of working. So what I've got here is a cadence ceremony of business owner syncs, so they can stay aligned. Now, let's look at the portfolio. What are some recommended cadences for that cross-functional leadership team to stay aligned? Typically, I have my portfolio leadership team looking at the Portfolio Kanban on a weekly basis, maybe if they're new, and maybe that gets pared back as they start to mature their practices. But that allows them to stay aligned, once again, as a cross-functional team on those different pieces that are going through the Kanban. The things that are in implementing. Do we still want to continue implementing those things? What about the things that are queued up in the backlog? Should we consider trading off some of the things we're going to continue to implement in exchange for something in the backlog that's probably going to deliver us more value? So having those conversations as a cross-functional portfolio leadership team is really important. Another thing that I've put in place as well is the epic owner sync. So if we've got epic owners that are driving value delivery across our portfolio Kanban, there may be value streams that are tightly coupled within our given portfolio, and there may be a need for them to work closely together, but there's more compelling reason to have the sync. One of them is making sure that, as they're working as an epic owner, that they're actually maturing their practices and learning from other epic owners. So it's a combination of building a good epic owner team, as well as working through any dependencies they might have with other value streams where they might have some key dependencies. The other cadence things that you're going to see here, though, too, are the portfolio leadership team is looking at the portfolio Kanban on a regular basis, but then there's also the fact that we have to keep alignment with our executives, right? Because we're serving our executives, we're trying to serve the business, so if we're prioritizing as we go and we're talking about different trade-offs and approvals, we need to make sure the executive team that's associated with our portfolio is in agreement with us. A lot of patterns I've seen in real life working with executives and leadership is that executives will actually swoop down and step in and do some of the work that your portfolio leadership team should be doing because there's a gap there. And the way to overcome that is to make sure that you form a portfolio leadership team where they can see that they're able to handle those responsibilities and they'll step away from that. But then there's still a need to have an executive sync or alignment to make sure that they're in alignment with what the portfolio leadership team is doing. And last but not least, a recommended pattern is around the portfolio prioritization process that is ahead of PI planning events. So you may have several agile release trains in a given portfolio. They may or may not be on the same cadence, but they may be part of some kind of strategic initiatives that are important to the portfolio. So it's important to make sure that at the strategic level, the things that are going to continue to be done in PI planning on these different agile release trains are agreed to by your executives and by the business owners and stakeholders. So that's what that really is there for. So those are some examples of some common processes that I put in place to help groups stay aligned. Now, the other thing I want to cover before we get to some questions is what about when we have trains that are not really mature yet? So if we don't have trains that are as mature as they could be, maybe we're not able to trust the velocity just yet, the velocity of a team or the velocity of a train. So what do we do instead? What are some other techniques that might be able to help us? Well, this is an example of a thinking tool that I've used at various places that actually can help us kind of give a big picture view if we have a mix of agile and waterfall groups, and that we also have maybe trains that are not as mature as they could be because they're still in the early stages of forming and starting to normalize their practices. So I know this is very hard to read. I don't expect anyone in the back of the room to be able to see this. So if you're straining your eyes, don't worry, it's not you, it's me. The way you want to look at this, though, is this is the portfolio Kanban backwards, and you actually have, this is the implementing state, this is the backlog, the portfolio backlog, this is analysis, and then this is the review state. And underneath here, what you have are the prioritized epics. So these are the prioritized epics. There's an epic right here, one here, et cetera. And then underneath that, you've got the trains. So in this scenario, I've got 3 different trains. And then underneath the kind of the train row here, you've got the teams on the train. So usually when you have a very immature train, ideally a more mature train has fungible teams, meaning a feature can come to the train and they can pull the highest priority and start executing it. But when you have a train that's in its early days, you might have more teams that are not necessarily fungible, so they're specialized. And you can start to slot out, what if I worked on this epic or continue to work on it, then which teams are going to be impacted on my train? And then for how many PIs will they be impacted? Because this is actually a 3 PI view. So there's 3 columns here. So we can see for this specific epic, for this specific team, they're going to be impacted for 3 PIs. For this specific team down here, same thing. And then when we start looking at the other epics, you'll see that pattern emerge. And then the columns over here are basically representing a summation of that. So you can kind of get the number of tick marks so you can start to see the impacts. And what this is really meant to help you with is I'm not mature enough to trust the data in my agile tooling yet. The teams are different levels of maturity. I might have some waterfall teams, but all of them are needed to deliver value to the business. So I need some kind of way to visualize, what is it, how long is it going to take, and then who needs to take part. So this is something I've used at a couple of different transformations, and it provides a nice visual view. One of the things I want to caveat against, though, is it's a thinking tool only, and it's not, these are not mutually exclusive tick marks. So I always caution against making sure that we're not trying to do pre-planning with this ahead of time. It's really just meant to give us a high-level view of where we think the impacts are. All right, so in summary, basically, LPM, Lean Portfolio Management, remains a core competency in SAFE, right? It doesn't go away. In 5.0, it actually, in my opinion, becomes more relevant because from a business agility perspective, Lean Portfolio Management practices are essential because you want to make sure that you have a good understanding of how strategy ties to execution, and that Lean Portfolio Management capability is where you do that. There's considerations to starting Lean Portfolio Management early. So we want to start those discussions and planting those seeds early on, and the SAFE implementation roadmap in 5.0 clearly articulates that. And I think that's a really, really good thing that's been done, very much needed. Even if you're not ready to stand this up yet, you can at least identify that, managing WIP, enabling flow, working together cross-functionally, all those things are good things, whether or not, you've got all of your trains stood up in your portfolio or not. So getting them started early is good. And then I showed you some practical approaches that I've applied on several transformations that help groups stay aligned and also help them get started. And then once again, that common thread is making sure that you always engage with multiple functions, that it's never going to waste time. Make sure that you engage with everyone. So with that, got about 4 minutes left. I just want to see if anyone had any questions or comments. Raise your hand. Okay.
Hi, Charlene. Thanks for the presentation. Curious, how do you deal with clients that have the annual capital planning cycle? They want to go LPM. They'll even kind of stand up the governance and so forth and the Kanban, but they're still like, but I know that this project was approved last year and it's above the line, so we got to get this through. How do you kind of rationalize those two different worlds?
First of all, you're always going to get that, especially in early on when you're trying to transition. So at least looking at the different projects that you have that you're either going to continue or you think are approved and are expected to start, getting all of those things visible, and then trying to affinity group them so you can see kind of the logical areas that they're supporting. And then I've actually used the technique of, even though they're using traditional project plans, having them complete like an epic statement or a lean business case so that they can translate their 100-page business case into something more consumable. And just doing that, having those discussions will actually flush out the fact that some of these really are not as important, or some of these actually we don't have to do all of it. So I think using these lean pieces, that's why I say I really love that this is very early in the implementation roadmap, is really beneficial. So start using that as an asset to help you in the discussion, and then help lead them to water. Is kind of how I want to say that. Help them help themselves on that one, right? Because I know that they're also going to tell you, we want to start the project, but we don't have enough people. Or, we can't start it because we're already full. So if that's the case that you're in, help them at least decide, well, can we get some value delivery? Can we chunk this down somehow? And those types of artifacts will help you.
How do you handle the Hippo in this? Because that is really key. I have more money, I have more power, I have more influence, so get my projects and my epics into the backlog, and you will do them first. So that's what we're dealing with, is whoever has the most money and whoever has the most power tends to be the ones that, get into the backlog and down,
Absolutely. Does everyone understand what she was asking for when she said Hippo? What's the Hippo, guys? The highest paid person's opinion. And I think that actually is something that hits most companies, right? Because that's normally how we prioritize. We might actually have business value, but usually it's the highest paid person's opinion. It's the executive that is part of the sales organization, right? Promising dates, and it's like you have to do it. Once again, the way that I normally will pivot groups to at least making the right decisions is putting everything in front of them, right? Because usually they're a senior level executive in this portfolio. They probably write checks to fund certain initiatives to start. But if you can at least give them the data to actually look at all the things that we've already started for you anyway, the sales organization, and these dates are already promised. These things are in flight, and we only have so much capacity to do these. So it's almost like you want to use the data, present it to them, and then let them make the decision on how to solve that problem. And then the behaviors will start to change. But you have to start with giving them the information right back to them, right? So you make them part of this cycle that I put on the other slide, where you've got that executive review and you've got that alignment with Lean Portfolio Management leadership team. That's how that conversation starts. I don't know who had their hand up next. Yep.
One quick question. When everything is ready in an epic and it's ready for implementation, my experience is that it's fairly easy for the teams to refine and get the features ready. Mm-hmm. But what I have identified is that actually analyzing these epics and getting them ready is what is actually taking all the time. But we don't have any ways to measure this or to actually manage the time used to analyze it. Is this an experience you share, and do I have any tools regarding that process?
Oh, there are plenty of tools that will measure cycle time for the different states in the Kanban. I can list them all, but I think your point is the expectation setting around the Kanban process, if you don't limit the WIP, then things are just going to continuously move through to the portfolio backlog. So that's one thing. One thing I recommended there was limiting how many things can go to the backlog, because then if there's already, say the WIP limit was 10, if there's already 10 things there, then you can't analyze anything now because you can't move anything downstream. So that will help you focus on the lean process of, stop starting and start finishing, which is what we want a Kanban system in place for. So putting that in place will help you. Also, if you want to use tools to measure cycle time between the time, I put something in review state and the Portfolio Kanban to the time I actually started implementing it at a feature level, you can certainly measure that. But I think it's a behavior and expectation setting that needs to be coached. I think that's the root of your problem and not necessarily the fact that there's a Kanban system. So we have to make sure that we coach the Portfolio Kanban and the program Kanban together so that we can start to see how it all connects and flows together. Because you don't really want to start the refinement process of features, until we know for sure, A, the epic's been approved, right? And that it's on the portfolio backlog and a high enough priority to where we know it's probably going to start in the next PI or so. So I think it's all three of those things. The data will help you, yes.
So to piggyback on that question, how much scope or definition do you suggest that we put at that top level? So an epic itself could span multiple quarters. It could be quite large. And so how much meat should we really focus on putting there?
So epics, you want to make sure that using the artifacts that we already have that are recommended in the framework, we got an epic hypothesis statement. And in 5.0, it's actually gotten a bit more, I would say, articulated in terms of business outcomes. So I want to answer that two ways. One of them is a coaching experience that I have, and then the other one is more from using the artifacts in SAFe. So if we've got an epic hypothesis statement, which is still a typically recommended pattern we use to write an epic, it comes from the elevator pitch for Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm, still use that because then I'll articulate what you're trying to do. But the lean business case will help shape how you get started. And the way you want to coach this is as, I need to start here, I'll create an MVP. If I find out the MVP is actually going to get us the value that we think we're going to get, then we'll start to execute on these additional features. So it's really about not trying to set the expectation that we have to build all the scope in the epic today or before we get it to the portfolio backlog. We just need to define how to start and what outcome we want to achieve and how we can learn. So that's a different mindset than most traditional PPMs have. So I think that's one of the biggest hurdles to get through. But that would be how you would want to tackle that. Okay.
Question. The lean portfolio management team, when putting that together, where from the business should they come? Should they be IT people, business people? What are the recommended successful team for those triage? Was only described as 2 in the 5.0.
Right, yeah. When you look at the portfolio kind of planning horizon in 5.0, it kind of just shows the epic owner, enterprise architect. But like I said, what we in the trio here that I recommend was we have business owners in there too. That's the other component because you still need the technical piece to understand the enablers to make sure that what you want to build is going to be viable. But you also need to make sure we're always engaged with the business. I'm the biggest advocate for getting business engaged in our process because I think it's a gap in most places. So business owner, enterprise architecture, and then having some kind of delivery person, whether it be the epic owner or somebody that's the delivery lead for the portfolio. However you want to position that is the minimum you need. But chances are, as you go through defining epics and looking at what you need to move it across to get approved, you're going to notice if your specific functions are missing based on your portfolio context, and you're going to want to engage and bring them in. So in a current implementation that I'm about to wrap up, my portfolio team has about 6 people on it. Because they're a highly regulated industry, so we actually have representation from operations and compliance and risk on there too, in addition to the business, IT, delivery, and the architecture group. So you have to really think about what's needed to get that and have the co-created epic discussion. If you're missing a role, they're gonna figure it out pretty early on. Okay. We good on time, I think? Okay, thanks everyone.